To come and speak to you today. I have a warm spot in my heart for anything Houston oriented because I think a lot of times people minimize what happens in this city. We're a huge place and a lot of security professionals really work on their own and we need to gather together. So to kick off this morning, I know I looked at the technical tracks in this conference and it's fantastic. Michael did a great job pulling things together. And I thought the last thing you need is a kickoff that's technical. You're going to be inundated with all kinds of bullets and slides. So what I wanted to do this morning is talk to you about a different approach and kind of a philosophical bent on what you need to do as security professionals. Now I know we have a mix in the audience of people that are really in deep on the technical side of configuring systems, working with technology. We have the management groups that are trying to figure out how they manage their programs. I want to take you a step further. And one of the things that I want to do when we start is talk about where we've been and where we're going. So with that in mind, things used to be simpler in the old days. Back when we had huge mainframes and data centers and we had controls around those and we knew where our data was at every time we walked in the door, and we knew who connected because they could only come in one way, things were easier to control. And frankly, the threats were different. Technology wasn't as cheap. And it was easy to recognize those threats. We kind of knew what they looked like. You had some forethought and foresight on what was coming at you. And even though they sometimes outnumbered you, you felt pretty safe on knowing how to fight that. That's an important thing to realize today, is we know how to recognize threats, right? Now, it wasn't a panacea. There were still unknowns. And back then, what you didn't know, you knew might be dangerous, right? And so, if it was strange out there or there were places that we thought there were unknown threats, you didn't go there. You didn't open it up. And that was an approach that was fairly accepted back then. Those of us that have the gray hair and worked in those data centers and on those SNA networks, we know what that felt like, right? And then the world changed on us. It's gotten complicated. First of all, we've seen technology and user communities just burgeon on us. And on top of that, the threats change too. They're a little better armed these days, right? And a little more powerful weaponry. And a lot more power on the desktops and in their mobile phones and remote devices now than we ever imagined back then. And what I'll say to you is get used to it. Technology happens. And there are things that are going to come at us from every direction. Now, philosophically, there's a difference in how your mind works when you get to that stage, right? There are whole new dimensions of things that we have to look at and understand. And sometimes it's bigger than any one person can handle. So it's very important to use teamwork, and that's where something like a conference like this really helps. You can't be an expert in all the fields where we need to know what's going on. And so the security communities are very important. Share the knowledge, share the expertise. Now, I work with a lot of lawyers, right? And we do a lot of discussions about what you can and can't say. And I will tell you that that's great in the business world and the agreements. In your security community, I encourage you to share information among yourselves. We really need to team up against the guys because the bad guys are sharing. You have to realize that. You can't stand alone these days on the side of the defense. So as we look at the major dimensions of what's going on in the electronic environment and our totally interconnected worlds, where your refrigerator now will talk with your microwave, I mean, it's really getting crazy, right? What happens when everything's networked together? Well, some of that stuff is sort of meaningless to us in terms of protecting our corporate assets or our intellectual property or our national defense. There are certain things you need to protect. So we have to think in different dimensions now and have a different approach. And now we've got a lot of different threats. If you look at the world around us, with all of the power on the different desktops and servers and things that are well within anybody's economic means to pick up. I mean, the iPhone I have on my belt has more memory and more capability than the huge computer I worked with when I first started in college. And that thing filled a room. So now you've got all this stuff running around with that kind of power, and you've got the wily user who has it in his hand. And 9 times out of 10, we find that a lot of the threats and the problems we run into are because somebody figured out accidentally how to use something and break something. Those incidental ways that people break our systems or make mistakes and find the software bugs that nobody thought about are real headaches for us. Now, that doesn't minimize the fact that there are a lot of really focused threats now. And there's a dark side of all this connection. Certainly, we're faced with that kind of a problem every day. And as security professionals, what happens is we get looking at what we have to look at day to day. The focus shifts from the latest threat to what's going on. And the interesting thing about it is it's additive. Nobody in their right mind runs around these days with systems that have no antivirus on them. That's like a given baseline. It's got to be there. We all know that isn't the thing that solves everything, but you certainly can't run around naked without it, right? And so what's happened over time is we see the baseline security moving upward and the expectations moving up, saying you've got to at least have all that stuff in place that we know about. As security professionals now, we're challenged because you have to look at all those broad spectrums of threats that are known threats and make sure that you somehow have addressed it or covered it or know what its threat is against your environment. That's a challenge to keep all that in your head, right? And so part of the problem we have these days is looking at the complexity of combining all those things together, and those are the things we know. All the items that kind of come at us from different directions that we expect to show up at our door as threats, we have to make sure we counter them or mitigate them. And as we do that, we keep running after those things and trying to beat them down, and it gets to be like the whack-a-mole game. If you look at the definition, I don't know if you can read that, but it's the practice of repeatedly getting at something or hitting something only to have more things that are same pop up again somewhere else. It's a losing proposition if that's where your focus is. And so we have to understand that's going to happen to us, but if that's where you're looking and that's how you're trying to fight it, it's a losing proposition. The world has changed, and anybody that's in the security profession has seen these headlines over and over. There's something new every day. And what's the most striking thing about some of the things in the headlines today? Nation state, international. The level of sophistication has changed. It used to be the old hacker community did it to count coup on people. I broke in, ha ha ha, and back out. I used to be amazed at how benign most of the hacking was back in the old days. Things they could have done that they didn't. It's not the same today. And when you look at what's happening today, you have to look at motivations. Take a step back and think about what is driving this kind of situation. Certainly we all know, if you are in business communities, you know that there's economic incentive out the kazoo. Why is everybody going there? There's big money in it now. We have run to put our commerce and our assets online, networked together, passing back and forth. The company jewels are in the ether, right? And like the old saying goes, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do you go after the net? Because that's where the money is. And so we had seen in the past several years the growth of really sophisticated criminal activity because that's where the money is. And anybody that has had identity theft or credit card fraud happen to them, and I would wager that how many in this room have had a problem with a fraudulent charge, an identity theft incident? Yeah, pretty typical. I'd say at least 30 to 40% of the people here have encountered that. I myself have done it. It's a typical problem. There are different protections and solutions that we have to just normally now apply in that kind of an environment. And so as we look at that world, the economic incentive is there. And the criminal type of organizations that like to go and rob those banks, those electronic banks, have plenty of money to pay for good skills these days to go develop it. So we're not up against the high school hacker in the corner anymore. Frankly, we're up against people that have very good skills, very good interest in technology, share shamelessly with each other, which is one of our main concern, right? We keep our secrets because our lawyers tell us to, and because we've always been told, make sure you protect your information. And the guys that are after us are sharing like crazy. They're posting online, here's how to go break something else. Here are the passwords that we found over here. So we have this horde of armies of skilled attack threats now pounding on our doors on a daily basis. Your perspective has to change on how you defend against that. And the next step that we found, certainly with Stuxnet and Flame and the follow-ons, is there are other big guns in there now too. The fact is that cyber war or cyber threats are now involving nation states. They've got big money, different kind of incentive, different kinds of philosophical bent on how to get in and out of places. And what's a key characteristic of that kind of activity? How long did it take them to figure out that Stuxnet was there or Flame was there? This is a stealth factor. It's no longer I got in and out and I'm telling people about it. They don't want you to know they've been there. They don't want you to know they still are there. And so part of this factor with espionage that's being sponsored and supported by nation states is that they're pretty good at hiding what they're doing. And we're now in the spot of saying, do I even know if I've been compromised? Do I even know if I have a threat someplace in my environment? Or can I tell when it's in and out of there? There's some interesting work now with the analysis on these that says it's been around for a long time. Over a year. Sitting, hiding, working. And the thing that's most scary is what's happening now as this comes out. The original groups that did this targeted type of attack and targeted stealthy work had focused targets. But as I said, the hacker communities and the criminal communities, they're not so discerning. They aren't so discriminating where they go. And they share shamelessly. As soon as they know how this works, you now see variants coming out like crazy. And frankly, there may not be as good coders. Maybe they don't know how to control it as well. And so by accident, even some of these best ones got out into unintended places. Now, as more and more people pick up that same attack technology and shove it into Metasploit or someplace else, you've got people that pick up the tool and go use it, and they're not discriminating in their attack. You'll get hit even by accident because they'll make mistakes. So it's something we have to think about. I'll add on top of that that we've also seen that there are another class of users or another class of threats out there that are even worse to predict. And that's people that have political or social agendas, philosophical agendas, and they're not economically motivated per se. They may not have national boundaries, but they have different views of the world. Now, go take an inventory of those threats, of those opponents. You'll find them all over the place. And they'll be on the fringe ends of some fairly reasonable concerns about social or economic environments. The fringe groups will jump on and use the technology to come and perpetrate whatever attack they think is worthy of their position. You're up against them too. And sometimes they're the hardest ones to predict. So, now that I've depressed you totally on what you have to face every day, we have to stop looking down in the weeds. Right now, we have to change your perspective. Instead of running around, doing the whack-a-mole, looking at the trees, trying to figure out what the next biggest threat is, we have to step back a bit change to that. Let's back up and take a look at what's happening, where we are, what the environment looks like today. So, like I said, from this to this, or maybe even this. Security professionals, whether you're down in the trenches working on the technology, or you're in the mid-management levels, or in the strategic levels, you need to think about something that's very important. Where are you headed? Do you have a strategic plan for your security program? Do you know what you're trying to accomplish? You know, it's one of those things, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there, right? Part of this is deciding what your program needs to look like, what your environment and what your organization needs to have in protections, what you're trying to do out there as a business or as an entity, and how you're going to swim in these shark-infested waters, right? Does everything that you do, every project, every incident response effort, anything you're working on in your environment, does that move you closer to one of your goals in your strategic plan? Because if you put in a temporary fix, but it's out on the fringe someplace, or it's opposed to what you're trying to get to in the end game, you're wasting time and energy, and you can't afford it these days. Part of the problem we have today is that security budgets never grow as fast as the technology features, right? We're always on catch-up mode. We all know that. And the demand is there before we even know how to manage it or fix it. We may not even know how to implement it right by the time it walks in the door. That's an uncomfortable position, but it's one of the things that's a fact of life these days. So when you step into a fray on a project, or you're working on trying to fix an incident or do an incident response measure with something that came up, as you look at solutions and fixes, you need to keep in your mind where you want to be in the end game. This is a very important step. It's a very important thing, because otherwise you're in the whack-a-mole mode and you can't win that game. Now, this little note on the bottom says technology helps tremendously. It's not the goal. We have to rely on technology. Just step back and think. How would you physically today handle manual intervention of viruses? Can't do it, right? You've got to have technology to look at antivirus. Is it 100% effective? No. You got a lot of 0 days out there, but there's an awful lot of stuff that it catches and keeps it out of your way. Same thing, anti-spyware, looking at what's going on with DLP implementations. You need the technology, and you got vendors out here that offer a lot of neat stuff. But you have to know where you're trying to go with that. Just because somebody's got a great product, plunking it down in your environment may or may not help you a lot if you don't know what's supposed to interface with that and how it's going to go. Because there is no one panacea product. There is no one, magic bullet technology. You got to be able to combine and manage and integrate that stuff to make it work. That's a challenge, guys, because that technology is changing as fast as the threats are changing. They're trying to catch up with what's happening out there and foresee what is in their environment, right? And they have a market incentive to try to sell you a really good product. Your incentive is to try to figure out how that technology applies in your environment to your goals. So you may find a whiz-bang product that really doesn't meet what you need to do. It doesn't make sense to get it, right? So as you take this step back and look at the larger picture, you have to decide what will integrate in your environment to move you towards your goals and your strategic plan. And doggone, yes, take advantage of the information and the capabilities that the technologies have to offer. Take a look at that. When those vendors come to offer you a demo of what it can do, take the demo, take a look at it if you've got time, because you need to understand what people are doing to try to either improve your environment controls or mitigate threats. Doesn't mean you have to buy it. You have to understand how that may or may not apply in your world. And you've got to cooperate with each other again. It's really important. Do you understand your own capabilities? What can you protect and what can't you protect? That has more to do with how your environment is structured and how your business or your entity operates than it does with the technology. I can build walls around things that are pretty impenetrable, but if that business can't operate in that environment, it's worthless effort. You have to understand what happens in your environment in terms of information transfer, information access, information sharing, and where the really critical stuff is. Now that's been a conundrum for most security professionals all along. How many of you have had the discussion with your groups saying, who's the data owner and where's the most critical data live, right? This is like the endless circle. Well, I don't know, ask the IT guys. No, wait a minute. The IT guys are the custodians. They're the guardians and the protectors. They don't own this stuff. It's a very difficult question because business people really don't know how to answer that well. And so sometimes you have to ask the question 5 different ways from different perspectives before you get some of the answers. And sometimes you have to take the first shot at doing the inventory of things you think are important and go in and talk to them and say, have I got it right? Start from a baseline ground that they don't have to start from scratch. You do some of that legwork. But if you don't know what you have to protect and you don't know how it has to flow in your business operations, you're never going to figure out how to apply technology or controls to actually get the job done. So it's a really tough question to ask. You need to know what you can do and what you can't do. So first of all, you need to know what you can protect and what you can't protect. And then you need to know where you can protect it and where you can't protect it. Remember those lawyers and those artificial boundaries we work with every day? There are times when you can't reach across and say, I want to lock this stuff up. It's over in a partner's environment somewhere. And you're relying on contracts and agreements to help you out. You better know what that language ought to look like, because a lot of the procurement people and the business folks don't know what you need to have included in there to help you protect that data. So you've got to learn a little bit about contracting and risk assessments and information agreements with partners and entities that you'll exchange data with. It comes as part of the territory now that we're all so doggone interconnected. You also better understand the risk appetite of your organization. Now, how many of you have taken risk assessment or risk management classes? A few. Okay. It's a really important thing to think about. I teach a risk class over at U of H, and one of the things I ask people is, what are some of the most risky things you do every day? And they kind of stare off into space and think about maybe their credit card. I said, how about driving on a Houston highway? Every morning you get in your car and you take off down the road and you hop up on that highway and you're going 70 miles an hour, even though it's 65 limit, with 5 lanes of people that are doing the same thing and weaving in and out. And what are you doing? You're probably tailgating if you're in Houston. And you're assuming that everybody else is going to follow the rules. Right? The most dangerous place in the world is 70 miles an hour hurtling down the highway with all these other crowded people doing the same thing, and meanwhile they're brushing their hair or they're talking on the phone and texting, deciding they had to get off at that exit 3 lanes over. And yet, do we stop driving to work because that's really, really dangerous? No. We accept those risks because we have a utility that says it really makes sense for me and it's very valuable for me to get from my house to my place of business every morning. So I'm going to accept that risk and go there. Now, do we think about it every day, about what those risks are? Probably not. If you did, you might stay home. You might telecommute. But the fact is, you do a lot of risk acceptance in your life for some very dangerous things. And that's your risk acceptance appetite. Your organization does the same thing. And you have to understand what kind of a risk acceptance environment you have, or a risk avoidance environment you have in your organization. Because if you don't understand how that operates, you'll be spinning in the wind when you try to talk to them about dangers out in the universe, right? In our network world. Your job, half the time, is to make people aware of the risks, because some people don't know it. I talk to relatives who jump on the internet and do all their internet banking, post to social networks and do all this stuff, and they haven't a clue what they've just exposed themselves to. They don't understand the risks. And if you coach them a little bit and explain it to them, You know, it's like the eyes get wide. Oh, I guess I shouldn't put all that out there that way. There are ways to do it safely, and there's ways not to do it, right? And so some of the issue comes into making sure you can communicate what the dangers look like out there without sounding like an alarmist. You have to be realistic. Once you've given them an idea of what those risks look like, then the business makes a risk decision, right? So if you understand, if I work for a very conservative banking group or an insurance group, they're pretty risk-averse people. They may not want us to put in the latest, greatest technology combinations that have never been tried before. Not their bag, right? But if you're in a startup that does a lot of innovative things and they're willing to invest and do venture capital, different kind of environment, right? Understand who you're talking to. And understand who will understand and support the plans that you have for trying to protect them. That's a pretty big order. So it's up to you to be able to communicate what the risks look like from that larger viewpoint and from your technical knowledge and your understanding of that networked environment. And you have to be able to then wend your way around your organization, identify who in there understands and has like mind. They understand what you're doing and have the same intent to help support your plans. Your job is to align your security goals with your organization, not the other way around. Remember, security investments in your company compete with all the other business investment opportunities. So you're up against the guy that wants to do other types of projects and investments for the company to make them revenue. You're over there trying to make sure that the wheels don't fall off while this happens. So you have to align with the business, and you have to put your organization goals in concert with what you're trying to do. However, remember your code. You guys understand what kind of environment you're working in. You understand what those threats are and what the obligations are. You're the responsible security advisor. And when something looks wrong, say it looks wrong. It may not be popular. It may be hard to do in the face of a lot of opposition. But guess what? You've got the obligation to do it. When I worked for IBM, we were doing data center outsourcing, we were doing different kinds of communications outsourcing, support for customers. And they ran the gamut from people that had their own security teams, and we just did the arms and legs work, all the way to the organization that says, okay, you got it. You know, I report to one head auditor in the company, and they have no IT staff at all. When you do that and you start talking security, they look at you with this blank stare like, well, what should we do? I don't think we want to put expense in there. Guess what? You have an obligation because you are the experts, you have the knowledge, and you should know what the minimum standard to do care is. You have an obligation to do that. If we let the customer say, well, I want to put my stuff online, but I don't really want to put antivirus, or I really don't want to put web protections on it, you know, I don't want to scan for vulnerabilities, we're negligent. We know better. We cannot let that happen. And so part of this is you've got a kind of a dual role. You're an advisor, and you're telling people what looks like a threat in your environment, yet you're trying to align with the goals of the company and say what they're trying to accomplish. You don't want to be saying no all the time, but you have to also tell them how to do it safely. And when you get to the point where you're at a fork in the road that says, we don't want to do it that way, we're going to do it anyway in a very unprotected way, you have to have the guts to stand up and say, I can't endorse that. This is absolutely going to be a killer if something goes wrong. They may not understand the threat. They may not understand the potential risk. Your job is to communicate that. But once the decision is made, the business is going to go do it. That doesn't mean that you say, okay, I'll put my stamp of approval on it. It's a politically incorrect thing to do, to dispute what the business wants to do when you know that something is very dangerous and very wrong, either for the shareholders or the value of the company or for the security of the company. It's an uncomfortable position. And if you're in the mid or high level management in the security environment, you'll be faced with that. Reality is that'll happen. So you may have to stand up and say, fine, you know, I've said my words, I've told you what I think, you have the right to override it. That doesn't mean that I will now change my story and tell you it's okay to do it. You have to be the security advisor with the code of conduct and the code of ethics that says it's dangerous out there. Out there be dragons, right? So, you give your best assessment, your best advice based on your knowledge and skills and your understanding of the threats and risks. That's your obligation. You help look for different solutions or different ways of doing things that mitigate those risks. Not saying no, figuring out how to do it better and safer. Get it down to a reasonable, manageable risk. Be ready to defend and support your recommendations and advice. That is a very important obligation for security professionals. And one of my favorite people in the world is Thomas Jefferson. And this quote is just so apt to what happens in the security world. In matters of style, you can swim with the current. But in matters of principle, you must stand like a rock. When it comes to the really important things that you know are dangerous or important to stand up for, you got to bite the bullet and do it. So, what I would say to you today is you're going to see a lot of wonderful presentations. You'll have a great set of tracks in here with technology information, things you can do, things you can use, innovative ways and creative ways to help you fight against those dragons out there. That's wonderful. As you collect those pieces of information, share with each other, make contacts with each other, keep in mind that your goal is to make sure you know how to apply that in your environment. Take the strategic view of how this applies in your world. It may be a wonderful product or invention or a wonderful way to do things, but it doesn't match up with your environment. Keep it in your hip pocket for later. Who knows, you may take a different job. The thing that you want to be able to do, though, is find the ways to improve your environment, protect your assets, help your organization, kind of wend their way through that sea of shark-infested networks today to do what you need to do in that environment. We all have to be there. It's not going away. Practice your practical scenarios. Look at what may attack your environment, what may be the things that you face, ways that you can use technology to help you, and look at it not only from the technological side, but also from the business approach. The most practical and profitable ways to do a security project is to find a business benefit at the same time that you find the security benefit. If you get that, and you can structure your project that way, you get a win-win situation, and you win not only friends inside your organization, but credibility for the next one you come along where it's just the dragon. So, test your positions with your colleagues and critics. Here's your environment to talk with. Make contacts and network with each other, and bounce ideas off people. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you go out. There are people that are doing proof of concept, trying things, find what works and doesn't. Share that information, because those bad guys are sharing. They're sharing shamelessly. And remember, it's easier to tear things down than to build them up. So, stick together. And go forth and fight those dragons. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions or if you just want to spout off some ideas, but we may have a little time to do that. Yes, Hart. Okay. The question was, or the statement was, there are many companies that know they've been breached and the ones that don't. There's two groups, right? The assumption there being you've been breached. I think that's probably pretty true. When you look at the things that have happened here lately, especially with the stealthy type of malware, you probably have at least some workstations someplace in your environment that have garbage on them. You may or may not detect it. Depends on how well you're monitoring things. And it used to be that you'd find those little things that were infected because they spewed a lot of stuff on your network, or they acted funny and you spotted them and went and got them, right? With the stealthy stuff, it's hard to do that. We found malware in places where it wakes up and sends a few packets and shuts down and waits, and wakes up and sends a few packets. And guess what? Back where I was talking about what we see today, web everything, they know you got firewalls. They don't try to bang against ports that you're blocking. They go through port 80. Everything's going through the ones that you open. Why? That's the easiest way to get in. It's silly for somebody to attack you someplace where you know you're protecting. So I think it's probably a truism. Most people now figure that someplace, somewhere in their environment, they're getting infected or they're getting a problem. And like I said, 80 to 90% of the trouble we hit are users that make dumb mistakes or things we've implemented or configured incorrectly that come back and bite us. It's going to happen. What you need to do is focus on how you mitigate those things. You should be thinking about incident response process. Things that you can do to isolate, mitigate threats, clean them up quickly. And if you need to do root cause analysis, grab some time to do that. And a lot of times it's just a matter of fix it fast. One of the things that's really interesting, we've got environments now that are all web-based. Everything goes through your browser. You have people pushing stuff out to the cloud. The cloud is an interesting term. The cloud can be anything from this nice little fluffy white thing over here to those really dark rain clouds over there. You have to understand when you go to a cloud what it means, what that environment is, what that provider looks like. And I'll just tell you a little aside that I have a good colleague, good friend in the security environment for a pretty big company, Netflix. They made the decision. They're going to the cloud. They could not afford to put up infrastructure internally on their own to match their really spiky demands. And it's interesting to think about that. One of their biggest hit times is right after the Super Bowl. Everybody's watching the Super Bowl, and as soon as that's over, they want to go download a movie and watch it. So what happens in their environment, they're looking at where their demand curves are, and they know as soon as the Super Bowl ends, they need to put a lot of servers online to meet the spike in demand for downloading and streaming movies. They said, we can't afford to have that reserve capacity sitting in our data centers. So they went to the cloud. And when they did, they said, oh my gosh, now what are we going to have to do to operate in that environment? They took a very creative approach. They created something called the Chaos Monkey. What they did is they made an agreement with their provider to put up on-demand servers. They built a dashboard, they internally built their own, to be able to spin up new servers. 20 minutes ahead of the end of the Super Bowl, they're bringing servers online, 50, 100, 70, whatever they think, and they're watching the demands go and bringing them up. Well, when they do that, they're actually doing it in an environment where they've got infrastructure cloud, and they build their own images for their servers. So they have 2 or 3 standard images with all the security stuff built in, and they spin them up with that image. Well, to make sure that the image is there and that it's operating correctly, they said, we better know what happens if it breaks. And so they built a chaos monkey that goes around and just arbitrarily knocks down a server. How well do they come back up? How well do they compensate? They practice that scenario. It's something they got to do, right? So their chaos monkey is going around just randomly bashing a server, taking it out of service, and watching it come back up again to make sure that they can recover. They did the same thing, built what they call a security monkey. It goes around and looks at servers and said, are your configurations set right? Are your configurations set right? If it's not, they call the chaos monkey. Kill that thing. Bring it up again. Now, what do? We go hunt for what's wrong in this thing, try to fix it. They said, we can't take the time to do that. Knock it down, bring up a fresh one with a reliable image. A creative approach to a very volatile and spiky environment that lets them manage it the way they need to manage. Do they get broken into? Heck yeah. They get things that get penetrated and that changes a security setting or tries to break into a server. Remember, they're streaming a lot of content that people would like to have. Neat movies and things they'd like to download. They kill it, start over fresh. Creative approach to work against the incident. Practice the scenario that fits what you need to be able to do. And so, will you get penetrated? Will you have a problem? Will you be infected? Yeah, it's going to happen. It's not if, it's when. What are you going to do about it? Practice. Figure out what makes sense to you, what you can operate in that world. So, did that answer your question? Any others? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have fun today. You bet.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Good.
Catch up later.
Okay.
So you're going to want to say hi. Brett said sorry he couldn't.
We'll begin our next session at 9:45. Please stop by the vendors.